My name is Victor Saroki, and I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I was born in 1957. So I'm the youngest of five children. My mother and father, Yelda and Zarifa Saroki, had three. I have three older sisters, Josephine, Vicky, and Mary. And then I have one older brother, Roger. And then, of course, I came along. I'm the youngest one. You know, growing up in Detroit back then, the Chaldean community was smaller, but it was a very close-knit community. So I always have memories of being Chaldean, knowing I was Chaldean. I went to grade school at Jesu, which was a Catholic grade school near our house. And I went to high school at U of D High School. Also, both of those were Jesuit schools. And there were some Chaldeans in the schools back then. Some of my cousins went to school at Jesu, and I had some cousins who were at U of D High School as well. So even though I grew up in the United States, in America, and in Detroit, when I was a little boy, we used to go to the Chaldean church in Hamilton. So we saw all the community on Sunday mornings at the church. And of course, my parents were close to their cousins and friends. And so they would come to our house or we would go to their houses. And still today, some of my best friends we grew up together. Alan Saroki, Joe Sheena. I mean, we all grew up as young boys playing together. And I still see them today. They're still some of my best and closest friends as my cousins. Well, I think my father was probably like most Chaldean men. He worked a lot. And, he had a store in Detroit, and it was a successful store. But he would work long days. And so I didn't see my dad as much, of course. So my mother was probably spent more time raising us. In addition, there was probably a little more of an age gap between my father and myself because I was the youngest. So, it wasn't like maybe some of the American fathers and dads would take their kids to the baseball game or play sports with them. My dad really didn't do that. I mean, my dad would work. Of course, he was a good provider, a good father, and he always believed in education, which that was something I think for our community and our generation was important. For me to have three older sisters who all went to universities, and in fact, they all got graduate degrees, was a big thing. And you oftentimes didn't see that. So my dad was pretty well educated. He had a high school education back in the old country before he came to the United States. So he completed his high school education, and he was the youngest in his family. That's why they sent him here to the United States and to Detroit to help the family back home. So my father appreciated the role of education and how important it was. But again, I think I grew up in a typical Chaldean American household. But I always knew I would go to college. I went to U of D High School was a college preparatory school. So almost all the boys who graduated from U of D went on to universities. And I went on to Lawrence Tech. And I became an architect, and I spent 5 years there getting my undergraduate degree and graduate degree. And then, I wanted to become an architect, and that's what I did. So regarding my parents and where they're from, both of my parents grew up in Talkepa. And now I've only been to Iraq once, and that was maybe about 10 years ago. I was able to go back there. But I used to have stories, and we used to see pictures and see how life was in the villages. But all we know is what stories that my mother and father would tell us about. And of course, the families all lived together, brothers and sisters and their children all lived together in one house. They were mostly farmers and merchants, and they worked on the farms. The men would work during the day, and the wives would stay home and raise the children and prepare the meals and cook. So, I mean, that was the kind of stories we would hear. But life was hard for them back then, but they were happy. They felt that they had a great life. They were free to do what they wanted. They lived in the villages, and they had many friends. And, they didn't know they were poor, even though they probably were. But once they came to the United States, my dad used to tell me when he came to the United States, what an eye-opener it was for him to come all the way across the world. And his was the classic immigration story like every other nationality who came to the United States. And he came through Ellis Island and he came to Detroit because the Chaldeans came to Detroit because of Henry Ford, and there was jobs and opportunities in Detroit because Detroit was a booming city in America. But when he came, the Chaldeans never went into really the automotive business. They were always independent. They were merchants, and they got into the food stores. My father actually started a store and worked actually for 3.5 years with other people in the food stores. And that was during the Depression back in 1929 and the early 30s. But after about 3.5 years, it was time for him to go back. He had continued to spend or send money back home. And he worked morning till night every single day, 7 days a week. And whenever he would get his paycheck, he would send part of that paycheck back home to his family and to his brothers and sisters. But after 3.5 years, he went back home thinking he was going to go back to Talkepa, and he did. But after going back to Talkepa, after being here in Detroit and the United States for 3.5 years, he said, I've got to go back. The opportunity, the life, the quality of life, going back to Talkepa after being in the United States was a big difference. So he told his brothers he was going to go back to the U.S. He married my mother. He came back to Detroit with his cousin, and they started a store together, Roy Dickow, Madoga they called him. And Roy also got married in Talkepa. And then my mom and Roy's wife came by boat to the United States 6 months later. And then they started their life and family together here in Detroit. So my father did go back, I think once, maybe twice, but I only think once. I'm not positive because I'm the youngest. But my mother never went back. But my father's family did eventually come here. He sponsored them, and over the years, his brothers all came here. And my mother's family, part of them came here, not all of them, but they were able to sponsor them and bring them here as well. Growing up in Detroit as a Chaldean, as a young man, even as a young child and then a young adult, I really felt very fortunate. I did not have any problems with the American community because America was my home as I grew up in Detroit. But I always knew I was Chaldean, and we knew about the background of the Chaldeans. But there were really no restrictions. My father always said, I'm going to want you to go to college. I could have gone to any university. In fact, I applied at University of Michigan and at U of D and Lawrence because all three of those universities had architecture programs. And actually, at first, I thought I was going to go to the University of Michigan, which my father would have let me go to any of those. I chose Lawrence only because I liked the curriculum at the time at Lawrence because they allowed me to start in architecture right away, whereas at U of M, you spent the first 2 years as your undergraduate studies, and you didn't study architecture until your junior year. And I wanted to find out, I was kind of anxious that I wanted to start architecture right away to make sure I was going to like it and enjoy it. So that's really why I selected Lawrence. So I had no restrictions. I think I grew up as a young boy in Detroit, and I went to good Catholic schools. The Jesuit priests that I knew, some of them knew Chaldeans, and even though the community was smaller, it was still a great and a very special community. And when we would go on weekends, maybe to Cass Lake, we would be with Chaldeans. If we were out with our cousins, we were all together as Chaldeans. So really, I think I was sort of privileged to be an American, but also to be Chaldean growing up in America. So we grew up in Northwest Detroit, around 7 Mile, Illinois. And actually, as a young boy, that area was mostly Jewish. Just like you see the Jewish community in West Bloomfield today. There were synagogues and I would say a big Jewish community in the area, which was actually very nice. We had a lot of Jewish friends, and we had a lot of American friends and Catholic friends because we went to the Catholic high schools and the grade school. So I associated oftentimes with the Catholic boys who were in those schools. So I became interested in architecture because my father was going to build a house, and he bought a piece of property in Beverly Hills. And he was going to work with Jimmy Jonah from Jonah Construction to build the house. And there was a Chaldean architect at the time. His name was Michael Nalu. And he was really the only Chaldean architect working in the area. So my dad went to Michael and designed a house. And I used to go to the meetings with my dad, and I used to see the way Michael would draw the floor plans and draw the elevations, and he would point out the windows and the doors. And I thought, wow, this is really fascinating how, beautiful it is to sort of see how you can design a building from scratch from the very beginning. Although, unfortunately, my dad never built the house. He cleared the property and he had the house staked out. But once he cleared the property and he staked the house out, he didn't like the lot as much as he thought he was going to. So he decided not to build the house. So he ended up buying a house in Farmington Hills and moved from Detroit to Farmington Hills. But my memory of him working with Mike on designing that house, I've always enjoyed that process. So I was always, as a young boy, interested in architecture. And that's where I started to pursue the architectural curriculum. And again, if you remember, I mentioned that I went to Lawrence as opposed to U of D or U of M because Lawrence introduced the students into the architecture curriculum in the very first year. And I didn't want to spend 2 years going through general studies and then in my third year try architecture and then find out architecture was not for me. And I had already been my third year of college. So I wanted to find out earlier than later. And that's really why I selected Lawrence, and it proved well for me. So I was in my early years in high school when my father started to design the house. And I remember going to my Jesuit priest counselors as they would prepare us for what we would be interested in to go to college for. And I told one of the Jesuit priests, I'm interested in architecture. He says, well, architecture is a great profession. I said, but we don't have any drawing classes or architecture classes in high school. And he said, you're right. It's kind of unfortunate we don't, because the drafting classes that most high schools give are more like trade school classes. And he says, we're not preparing the students at U of D high school for trade school. We're preparing you for professional degrees. So I was at a little bit of a disadvantage coming out of high school because I had no drawing skills. And I remember my first day in architecture class at Lawrence where the professor said, how many people have had some drawing and skills? And everybody raised their hand. And he says, how many people have had more than 1 year of drawing skills? Everybody raised their hand. He goes, okay, I guess we're going to skip all the basics and we're going to go right into some more advanced techniques. And I was really embarrassed. And I went up to the professor at the end of the class and I said, I don't have any drawing skills. I've never drawn anything. And he said, unfortunately, I can't hold the whole class back just because of you. You're going to have to take some counseling and tutoring to catch up with everybody else. And I did. And at the end of that class, I was fortunate. I found somebody that I worked in Town Square Market for George and Jean Maddie in the summers as a stock boy. And one of the senior stock boys was actually in architecture class. He was a senior at Lawrence. So I went to him and I said, Ron, can you help me tutor me? And I'll pay you for it. And he said, of course, I'll help you. So I used to go to his house every night and he would teach me how to draw, how to do things. So I was way behind in the class. And at the end of that class, I was the only student that got an A in the class. And I asked the professor, I said, you got to be kidding me. I can't be the best student in the class. He goes, you may not be the best student, but you achieved the most because you started with nothing and you excelled to be as good as all the others. So, you apply yourself, and I have to give the credit to, our parents and, we've always, as Chaldeans, we always believe in a hard work ethic. I see that I always saw that in my father. I see it in my father-in-law. My father-in-law is Eddie Jonah, growing up with him in the store business, because Michelle and I, we got married young. And when we started our architectural practice, Michelle and I started together. It was just her and I. And she did all the paperwork and the business side of things and some of the promotion, and I did the architectural work. And now it's been a family business, and now I have my son Alex, who became an architect. Now he had the advantage of going around the world and studying in other universities, University of Michigan and University of Pennsylvania, which has a really premier architectural school, and he studied in London and in France as well. So, but he's a partner with us in our firm and an architect in our office. So we're going to pass the baton to him because he's going to take this firm and this business and take it to another level. When I graduated from architectural school, I started in Birmingham. And I thought Birmingham is a nice little city. I wanted to be in an urban environment. So we started over 40 years ago. And I started with two other gentlemen who we started together just to help each other out. But then Michelle and I got married, and I went off on my own and started my own firm with Michelle and I. And so that was 40 years ago. We're going to be celebrating this year our 40th anniversary. So we've always had our practice in Birmingham, and we've moved to different offices, and we've started buying buildings in Birmingham and developing buildings in Birmingham. We've done almost 100 buildings in Birmingham. Our firm has probably done more buildings in Birmingham than any other firm in the city's history. We've done things like the Townsend Hotel, the Willits, the Birmingham Theater, office buildings, our own building that we're in. I also live in Birmingham, and we've done many homes all throughout Birmingham and Bloomfield. And of course, we've done a lot of work with the Chaldean community. We've done stores. I used to do my father-in-law stores, the Merchant of Vino stores, and then now we do it for my brother-in-laws, the plum markets. But we've done a lot of the stores for Johnny Carmo, the market squares, and we did, of course, Shenandoah. We did St. Thomas Church, and we did the Chaldean Community Foundation in Sterling Heights. And we're going to be doing we're working on now, the new Chaldean Community Foundation in West Bloomfield. So we've had a very diverse and I'll say prolific practice. It's been very good to us. We also do some development. So as an architect, a natural extension of what we do in real estate is to work with developers, and oftentimes I've partnered with developers to do projects together, like Ron Bogie and ourselves and other partners, and our family and my brother-in-laws also. We own retail and office and shopping centers. But my core business is an architect. That's our bread and butter, and that's what we have built our practice on. And as you can see, we've been very successful to receive over 100 design awards. Most of them are from our organization, which is the American Institute of Architects. So it's called AIA, and AIA, or the American Institute of Architects, is the largest architectural association in the world, but it's the organization for the United States. And I've always been a member. I've been very active in AIA. I'm a past president of AIA Detroit and AIA Michigan. I'm fortunate enough to have received the gold medal from both AIA Detroit and AIA Michigan. And I've also received from the National Association of American Institute of Architects fellowship. And fellowship is the highest distinction that an individual can get in architecture. And just over 1% of the architects are fellows. Of all the architects in the world, there's about 2,000 fellows in the entire world. So I'm fortunate enough to be one of them. And I was also fortunate to get it at a young age, just in my early 40s. In fact, most people get fellowship at the end of their careers as a recognition for all of the work that they've done. And it's not just doing good work to receive fellowship. It's how you've used your skills and your talents to do good work to advance society, to advance culture, to advance the built environment. And so a big part of my work was all of the advancement we've done in Birmingham and how good the city has become and all of the projects we've done. And we've raised the bar because of the notable work we've done in the city of Birmingham to make it a better city. So my involvement in the community goes back to obviously my parents and my father being very active in the community. And my father was one of the founders of the club, and we were very fortunate, or the members back then were very fortunate to have Southfield Manor. And I remember as a young adult going to Southfield Manor. And when Michelle and I got married, we were able to join Southfield Manor and have our own membership. So I used to be able to associate with the Chaldeans there and go to the club there. Um, then, of course, as time went on, Shenandoah was being talked about, and Mike George and the Chaldeans bought Shenandoah to be the next home for the Chaldean Club beyond what Southfield Manor was. So they put a committee together and they interviewed a handful of different architects, not just Chaldean architects. There was a few Chaldean architects, but they also interviewed some larger architectural firms that were not Chaldean, but well known in the Detroit area. Fortunately, we were selected to be the architects for Shenandoah, and that was really a nice tribute for us and an important project for us because it was important for the community. And it's going to be part of the legacy of what the Chaldeans have done in the Detroit area, but and for the families to enjoy it, and also a legacy for myself and my son and our firm. So we have enjoyed the success of Shenandoah and to see how much it's grown. And we continue to do work there. And there's always ongoing projects because it is evolving and growing, and where we've expanded the pool decks and the splash pad and the outdoor pavilion. And we've renovated even the dining rooms. And then, of course, we did the Chaldean Cultural Center there. And it was always intended to have it there. It just didn't start right away. It was sort of, the space was always allocated for it. But it took some time to mature and to really get enough momentum to start the design and start the construction. So, we were very involved in the beginning, along with my sisters, Mary and Josephine, and then other board members like Rod Kathawa and Francis Boji and the others, as part of the original core group. And Rosemary and Virgin. But we also worked with museum designers from New York, Saylor and Sorolla. And so they were really, as museum designers and curators, they understood how to put the exhibits together and how to tell the story. So while we were involved in the project architecturally, really the interiors, the exhibits are credit to them. So in building the museum, it was not a large museum, but it had to tell an important story. And, making sure that the story was accurate and credible and, gathering the data, gathering the facts was really important. We were fortunate to have a lot of very knowledgeable people on as the original core group who knew the background of the Chaldeans, knew they did a lot of the research, and Saylor and Sorolla did a lot of research as well themselves. But I think telling the story in a very professional and authentic way for a non-Chaldean community and the Chaldean community. We have to tell the story for the non-Chaldeans, but this museum was also done so that the next generation of Chaldeans would know if they are born here in the United States, what the history and what the roots are of the Chaldeans. Then, of course, there is the natural things of financing it, raising the money, selecting the museum fabricators. The whole experience took a lot longer than any of us thought. It took many, many years. But it did finally come together, and when it did, I think all of us were very proud of it. It's a very well-told story, and when we take people there and they see it, they're really impressed. They're impressed with the storyline, the quality, the history, the thousands of years of history that they didn't even know about the Chaldeans. Many people who are not Chaldean, they hear about Chaldeans in the community here in the Detroit area because we have a big population, but they don't know the thousands of years of history that go back to really formulate the very beginning. I think many of us were really dedicated to seeing the museum through. And even though it took many years and a long time to put together, the original core group stuck together. And we were excited about it. We didn't mind going to the meetings and spending the time. And everybody had a role to play. Some people were involved in research. Some people knew other people and knew how to get things done. Some of us were better at raising funds and getting businesses to contribute because we had to raise the dollars to build the museum and build the exhibits. And then, it took a long time, but that's okay. Hard work doesn't kill anybody, and things usually take longer than you think. I mean, we do buildings all the time, and I tell every owner it's going to cost you more than you think. It's going to take longer than you think. So, I mean, that's just, we understand that's the challenges, and hopefully the results are worthwhile. So, after the war in 2003, I had an opportunity to go to Iraq. And the U.S. government wanted to try to help rebuild the country, but because a lot had changed, the government had collapsed, and they wanted to rebuild the infrastructure. So there was a group of us that we put together of local Detroit architects, contractors, engineers. Jamal Calabat was with us, and we started a group called ICON to build a coalition of building engineers and architects and contractors who could help assist in the rebuilding of Iraq. So about 10 years ago, several trips were taken to Baghdad. I only went on one of the trips. And it was obviously a fascinating trip for me, but there was still a lot of security. I mean, we had soldiers with us. We were staying in very secure areas. We went to the U.S. Embassy. But it was my first time in Iraq, and we only were able to see Baghdad. And while we didn't really get to see everything because there was so much security around us, it was really a wonderful experience to go back and see the country, to see the city, even though there was a lot of barricades and security issues around us. We kept ICON going for about 5 years, but and we actually won several projects with the different ministries of education and housing and a new petroleum university. But when ISIS came on the scene, everything stopped. And everybody said it's too dangerous to do any work there or go back there. So really, that was our one-time experience going back to Iraq and trying to do some work there. But we decided it wasn't in the cards for us to do that. So for us, there are no future plans necessarily to go back and help rebuild the country, at least for ourselves. But I'm hoping that there will be Chaldeans, when things get better and get safer, who will go back and reinvest in the country because I think there is a lot of opportunity. And it would be important, I think, for us to try to rebuild the churches and the villages and places like Takepa, and especially for the Christians, to have their history preserved. And, we can do our part here in the United States. And through the Cultural Center, we can tell the story of the Chaldeans and the history and the very important history of their role in the world, and especially in the Middle East. But it would be wonderful if things can get better and safer in Iraq, that history can be preserved there where it belongs to be. Growing up in the United States and being born here, I maybe don't have the same connection as Chaldeans who grew up in Tel Kappa or grew up in Baghdad or in other villages. But it is part of our roots. It is our family. My father and mother were from there. A lot of cousins and friends were born there. So it was a sad time to see the destruction and the war and people losing their lives and the churches being raided. And so it is a sad time. But, sometimes with tragedies, there is opportunities that will come out of it. And all I can hope is that in the future, our traditions and our culture and our heritage will be preserved. I think I can only speak for what I know here, that our Chaldean community is very, very well respected. People in Birmingham know I'm Chaldean, and they know how, and in the Detroit area and in West Bloomfield, they know how successful the Chaldean community is. I have friends from other ethnicities, Greek and Italian, and they say the Chaldeans have like leapfrogged over all of us. And look how much they've done in such a short time and how strong the community is. And it's kind of a source of pride for us, to see that we have been so successful. And not only because we've worked hard and we have been careful to raise our families and our children in good environments. Our children are now becoming doctors and lawyers and successful business people, not just store owners, and getting involved in all kinds of aspects of the United States and development, and not only just in Detroit, but now it's growing around the country. So I think the Chaldean community is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's smart. It's strong. It's growing. It's got financial strength. And there is a lot of opportunity for everybody. It isn't just the previous generation or my generation. The future is going to be our children. And, every father or mother wants to see their children do better than them. So as Chaldeans, we want to see our children do better and our grandchildren do better. And they are. And when we see how successful the Chaldeans are, Chaldeans that were older than me or my age or younger than me, very successful, it's a source of pride for all of us. And, I hope the Chaldeans will always stay together. I hope they, naturally every culture becomes sort of more acclimated into the American society because they're part of the American society. But I hope the Chaldeans will stay together. We're part of America and we're part of American society, but that's why we have places like Shenandoah and where the Cultural Center can tell the story about our history and our roots. That was what was really important in building Shenandoah, that we would bring families and children together. We have the food together. We could relax and enjoy each other's companies and have important life events there, showers and weddings and baptisms. These are all happy occasions, and to have our churches nearby. Obviously, the churches play a big role in the life of the Chaldeans. I was at a meeting the other day, and Bishop Francis was talking about the next church they want to build in Commerce, and they were talking about Bay Point Country Club, and he says, the Chaldeans want to be near their churches, and it's true, they do. We like to be close to the churches, where he says they can walk to the churches. Well, we want to be near our community, and we want to socialize. We want to go to school together. We want to be able to go to dinners together and have those important life events, if it's weddings and other important ceremonies and graduations and baptisms. All of that's important. So I hope the Chaldeans will continue on the success that we've had. I have no doubt that the next generation will be more successful than us, and more affluent than us. I just hope that they will continue to stay together and keep the traditions of what makes us Chaldean, and I just hope that that continues.